Good morning, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jackie G, and I'm with Gwartzman's Art Supplies here in Toronto. Michael is here to talk about his fantastic oil paints, which we've had the pleasure of stocking for several years, and his fantastic mediums that he's just put out in the past, I'd say 1 to 2 years, that are absolutely amazing.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for listening in, and thank you for Gwartzman's, Jackie and Michelle for making this happen. I think I'm right in also saying that Gwartzman's also carry our watercolors, which I think you sort of forgot to mention, and I hope our primers. So it's oil paints, mediums, primers, and watercolors that I'm able to talk about. I'll start, if I may, by giving a bit of a personal history. I was fortunate enough to grow up in the English countryside, and I had a rather wonderful grandmother who came to live with us when she was on her own. And we lived in an Edwardian house and really lovely countryside. I was very lucky as a kid. And she was an artist, quite unusual. She'd been born in the 1880s, and she was what was known as a blue stocking in the UK, meaning that she was going to pursue a career. So in something like 1911, 1912, she became an art teacher, and that was her career. Apart from also being a mother to my father and the family and so on. So I was very blessed to be sort of brought up in that sort of environment. I was never academic, so the only thing that I was any good at was a bit of painting and drawing, you could say. So it became my thing in the family. I was sort of the artist, and so that was the seed, if you like. I went on to attend art school. I went to Medway School of Art and Design in 1976. I then went on to do 3 years of fine art in a rather obscure college in Epsom, which is on the outskirts of London, famous for the horse racing derby. And I spent 3 years doing the fine art. And now the key thing about this is that I didn't shine as a student in the slightest. A lot of my time was wasted too much with the distractions of, shall we just say, being young. But anyway, I still lived and thought about art all the time. And coming to the end of my 3 year fine art course, I decided one day to treat myself to a trip up to our National Gallery. And of course, I headed straight for the Dutch section, pay homage, of course, to good old Rembrandt. And I was standing looking at, for me, what is the quintessential self-portrait. It's got the curved top, and it's described as a self-portrait at the age of 34. And I was standing in amazement looking at this painting, thinking, why can't I paint like this? And I hear a lot of people probably laughing right now, sort of, well, there's a thing called genius, Michael, which, yeah, absolutely. I didn't have the genius aspect, and more importantly today, I didn't have the paint either. And of course, as I looked at each painting and the caption beneath, depending upon whether it was on panel or linen or whatever it was, I looked at a little thing underneath which said, all on canvas, all on linen. And I sort of thought to myself, well, this is strange because this doesn't look like a medium that I'm used to. I paint in oils, and I thought to myself, and I thought, well, why can't my paintings look like this? So when I got back to college I went and had a chat with the college professor who was sort of, if you like, the guru on art history and materials. But when I said to him, Graham, I've just been up in the National looking at oil paintings, and I'm trying to figure out why my paint doesn't look like his, and he just nonchalantly smiled. Yes, 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 of course. Well, look, Michael, you have to remember that at one time, artists used to all make their own paints. And at that moment, a little light went on and go, oh, well, if artists used to make their own paints, so will I. It's quite a simple process, but you need to get the book, The Artist's Handbook of Methods and Techniques by Ralph Mayer, which even to this day is always referred to as the Artist's Bible. And I invite everyone to get a copy. Don't be daunted by the size. It's a good thick 500 pager, but there's only about 100 pages there which are specifically pertaining to sort of matters around oil paint and oil paint making. But it's a must have and a great read. And I read the section on how to grind your own colors, and I thought, this is too good to be true. It's so easy. And of course, when you're sort of 20, no mountain's too high to climb. And so I thought, well, by the end of next week, I'll probably be painting like Rembrandt. Needless to say, I'm still working on that one. But anyway, I did get a lot of success with the paint. I made a modest investment in the Muller and slab, which is, if you like, a flattened out version of the pestle mort, where you have two flat surfaces which effectively can grind, smudge the paint, really more than grind. Anyway, and the colors I chose, first of all, I thought, well, I won't go for those really tricky parts of the Rembrandt straight away, the face. I'll just go for a shadowy background, like the one that's in the self-portrait I mentioned. So of course I chose burnt umber and raw umber. And they're quite easy colors to work with. They're not horrendously dusty. They dry very fast, as a lot of you will have noticed on your own palettes and paintings. So I was off. I was hand grinding away. More importantly, when I came to paint with that paint, it was one of those moments where I looked and I thought, ah, yes. Now I'm starting to see the sort of the fruity, luscious, luminous qualities almost of a brown. Even browns were starting to glow. So I thought, well, here we go. And I went into one of those moments of painting. When you're painting and it's as if time stood still, but then you look at the clock and X number of hours have passed by and you think, where have I been? One of those moments happened, and I stepped back from the portrait I was painting and I thought, oh, did I just do this? Not only had the paint taken on a new resonance, I was able to, I don't know, just something quite sort of almost mystical happened. Fellow students came to my studio area and they looked at the painting and went, whoa, someone's had a good day, haven't they? Bit of a breakthrough. Is it a new medium or something? What are you using? And no, I'm making my own paints. No, no, come on, tell us the truth. What is it? A new medium that Winsor & Newton's brought out? I said, no, 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 look. And I showed them. And they went, wow, you're not kidding. You are making paints. And then, of course, they understandably said, well, can we try a bit? So I tubed them up a little, open end of tube, scooped some bits of stuff I had left over in and sent them all off with a bit of paint each. The next day, they're sort of the back in my studio. Michael, you need to come and we need to have a chat with you. You need to see what you've done to our paintings. And at first I thought, oh my goodness, something terrible's happened. When I got to the studios, I realized they were also having the same type of, I won't necessarily call it a breakthrough, but a significant jump. You could see there was more enjoyment of the material, which is, I think, is a key part of the activity, was now starting to take place. Now, remembering that I was coming to the end of my 3 years studying fine art, and like every art student who leaves college, I was thinking it's a bit like walking off a cliff into an abyss. What am I going to do? How am I going to live? And of course, most of us at the time were sort of resolute in that we were going to have to probably get bar work, waitering, tables, whatever it was to be. And all that's character building anyway. But then I had this little idea. I thought, well, maybe if I make a bit of paint for my friends and myself in my studio, I can sell it to these friends. Who knows? Maybe I won't have to get the bar work and I can be in my studio all day long, doing a bit of painting, bit of paint making. Now, to also give you a better picture of what was going on, my new rented accommodation in my friend's house was going to be my bedroom, my studio, and now was going to become my paint making area. So it was a 15-foot by 15-foot room, and I had a beautiful old brass bedstead in one corner, and I collected antiques at the time. I had sort of a very, a handful of modest antique paintings that I worshipped and so on. And you get the scene. It was like something from the 19th century. I tipped his wardrobe, my friend's wardrobe, on its side, which created a wonderful workbench for my mixing, grinding, pigment jars. And that's how it was for several months. I started, as I say, supplying the friends. Then out of the blue, the phone rang one day, and it's a gentleman introduced himself, and he said, "Hello, Mr. Harding. My name's Tim Miller. I'm calling from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I've heard remarkable things about these paints that you're making to ancient recipes." And I was like, "Oh wow, this is the V&A calling me." And he said, "Yes, we've got a project I'm wondering if you might be able to help us with. We've got an 18th century organ that came from Fonthill Abbey. Fonthill Abbey was an extraordinarily exotic house built by a guy called Beckford, who was an incredibly rich guy back in the 18th century. And he'd built this, well, you can find pictures of it, drawings of it, I'm sure online. And it was more of a sort of a folly, and it was built in an unconventional way. And it over the coming decades, it fell down, collapsed, burnt, all sorts of things happened to it. So Tim Miller explained, we've got the organ that Mozart played upon out of Fonthill Abbey, and we've been restoring it for the last 3 years, taking off all the old white lead primer. And now we're looking for a lead primer or someone who can make the lead primer for us to restore it with. Would you be interested? And I said, oh, of course I would. I'd be honored. And I said, but hang on a moment, this sounds quite big. And he said, well, look, before you sort of get daunted by the amount of paint we're going to need, the good thing is that it has to be very dilute to almost a milky consistency with turpentine because it has to go on in about 6 layers so that the detail of the carving isn't sort of obliterated by goopy paint. So, okay, fine, fine. So how much do you need? And he said, well, we need about, I think it was 60 litres. From my point of view, a colossal amount of paint, although it was going to be let down in a couple of stages with turpentine. But I was still going to have to be making about sort of 30, 40 litres of paint. Now, bear in mind, in those days, my output capacity was probably about a decent sized tube an hour. And I sat and I thought for a moment, and bear in mind, I went to Epsom School of Art and Design. I didn't go to the London School of Economics. I jumped on a calculator and I thought, yeah, this is probably going to be at least 3 weeks of work. Okay, yeah, I've got to do this because it's so prestigious. So I said, yeah, of course I can do that. It took me sort of 3 months in the end. And again, in the midst of all this, the phone rang again. Gentleman had introduced himself and he said, my name is James Trimble. I'm the head of painting or materials at the Royal College of Art. I'd love our students to have a go with your paints. Can I give you an order? And again, it was something like 450 tubes. It was getting crazy. So this was clearly taking over my life. And I thought, well, all right, why don't I work hard on this paint making business of mine for a year or two? Then I'll probably be able to retire. Because, as I say, I didn't go to the London School of Economics. And I see Jackie nodding there because she's getting her head around sort of businesses are a very strange thing. They come with their own set of laws of physics, if you like, laws of financials. And even if you're selling paintings, you're in business. And we all discover that everything takes 3 times as long, costs 3 times as much, and everything that can go wrong certainly will as an obstacle. So, of course, when I dedicated myself to this drive on early retirement at the age of 21 or whatever I was, 22, of course, it started snowballing on, and neighbours had heard that I was probably going a bit mad at the time with this sort of alchemist bedroom cum studio, and a very nice lady offered me her cellar. So I moved all the apparatus into the cellar. The cellar then became too small. I moved, and then I started renting an industrial unit just outside Tunbridge Wells in a place called Southborough, which is the north of Tunbridge Wells. And that's when I started making real business mistakes because I was starting to incur mounting costs. And so it went on. And I thought, well, all right, I have to advertise now to tell the world about myself. I made a silly mistake. I started buying advertising that the money wasn't coming into service. And so I couldn't pay the advertising debt. I was taken to court. And that was a rather significant date. That was now that any of you will know in the UK that 15th of October 1987 was a very significant date because we had a small hurricane. We had winds of 120 miles an hour. It flattened like 50% of the forestry, the timber in my part of the world. And guess what? The next day I woke up, I was in a new industry called forestry, which I absolutely loved. I spent 4 years working out in the countryside, clearing up all the timber. Eventually, that work all finished, and I was now in a dilemma of what to do. And a friend said to me, he at the time, a guy called Neil Farquharson was working one of these living museum things, and he said, we're commissioning murals, Michael. Perhaps you could get the commission if you've got a lot of paint left over. And cutting a long story short, because I want to get onto the material thing which we're all here for today, I got the commissions. I ran out of paint. I started making more paint. Artist friends came along and said, we need that paint, Michael. So I was pushed back into business several years later. Now, this time around, I had very good fortune in meeting a husband and wife, entrepreneurial couple, Mr. and Mrs. Mark and Jeannie Winthrop, still good friends, and they're based in London with a store called Atlantis. And they just said, look, why can't you just come and make this with us? And you'll be our sort of in-house paint maker. And that's what we did for 4 years until one day, I put it mildly, I helped them to have a fire. Now we're going to jump into the material thing about the paint today, which is very, very important to get straight to the reality of, if you like. With artist oil paints, there's a danger of spontaneous combustion. Some of you will know this, some of you won't. I knew about it, and when I was cleaning up, I had piles of rags, as you can imagine, because I was using sort of 10 times the amount that any individual artist would be using for all my cleaning of my apparatus and stuff. And I had them deposited into a bucket of water. Unfortunately, it was a warm time of year. It was April, humid spring. Some of the rags were now protruding through at the top. And the problem is that oil paint, particularly on cotton rags, is a dangerous spontaneous combustion. And it's not just Michael Harding paint, it's anything with linseed oil in. Any artist paint, effectively, should be regarded as a fire hazard. So I'll tell you in a second about how to dispose of the rags in a better way. So lo and behold, of course, it was a very small contained fire. A Canadian friend actually put the fire out, good Canadians. He was working at Atlantis at the time. Fortunately, Patrick had done a couple of firefighting courses, and he jumped on it, put the fire out probably in seconds, and then, of course, the fire department turned up. But to say I was unpopular was an understatement, and although it had been something which I'd tried to prevent, I had taken it for granted. I'd neglected the situation and allowed this fire to occur. So that's when I moved to Whitechapel. But anyway, coming back to the spontaneous combustion thing. When oil paint dries or cures or polymerizes, whichever term you like to apply to it, it creates a little bit of heat. Now, the problem with that heat, if you've got it all bundled up tightly in a rag, that heat can't escape, can't dissipate. And so, of course, you'll remember from school chemistry days, more chemical reaction, more heat. So you end up with a vicious circle, of course, until poof, things go up in flame. Since then, I've had another two fires, but I take it so seriously, and so should you. And as you can imagine, in our colour mill, we use copious amounts of rags for cleaning everything that we do on a daily basis. We get those rags out, we keep them in metal bucket containers away from the building. Now, you can buy online special flip lid bins made of metal specifically for this problem, because I think the printmakers also have this problem with various etching inks and so on as well. However, I was talking to an artist friend a year or so ago, and he said he had a fire in his studio, and the fire chief, of course, had come and they were investigating it. And he said to the fire officer, "Chief, I thought these bins were fireproof. They're meant to be 95% fireproof, aren't they?" And he went, "Yeah, they are, but you're one of the 5%, aren't you?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, the penny dropped at that point." So my advice to all artists is, when you clear up, get the rags, paper towels, whatever it is, away from buildings, out. I mean, what I personally do, I've got a discarded barbecue. And when I'm painting at home, that is, in my studio here in studio, it's anywhere in the house, actually. Whenever I clear up, I take the rags outside and I burn them. It's normally paper towels here. I just want them gone. And of course, discarded barbecue, nice and far away from the house. Burn them, can't burn twice. So that's what I advise everyone to do. If you're more concerned and you want the waste disposable people to take it away, I think I'm right probably in saying that waste disposal, they collect a lot of stuff that has fire risk. So it's something that they're well versed in. Let them deal with that. Just get it away from the house, studio, wherever it is. Now, coming back to what really made my paint different. Now, when you make paint for yourself, of course, the criteria is different. It's not so much about making a mass-produced material. You're trying to make the best paint you possibly can. So you're putting in all the good stuff being the pigment and oil. Now, if you think about oil paint in simple terms, the oil acts as the glue and it glues the color into place. So it's a two-part material. We have to also on occasions put in a very small amount of a wax-like substance or wax itself, which stops the laws of physics because, of course, pigments usually are either heavier or lighter than linseed oil, so the pigment will either sink within a tube or rise to the top. I mean, that's simple physics. And wax is very good at helping the oil and pigment stay incorporated together. But the key thing I do is that and as I did in those days, because I was trying to make it so I was putting as much goodness in for myself, because don't forget that glue of the linseed oil, which if you like is Mother Nature's gift to us artists. I mean, not only do we have linseed oil, but of course we've got flax in the form of linen. So yeah, I mean, Mother Nature was incredibly kind to us, giving us those two wonderful materials to work with. The good thing, of course, about a high pigment load is not only does it mean that the resistance to the UV light is greater because all the pigment particles are nicely packed together, it also means the bang for the bucks, as it were, the zing that you're going to get as an artist when you paint is also there. I often joke and say to artists, I literally want to poke your eye out with color. I want my colours to be so vivid and intense for you so that you're seeing a richness, a luminosity, the vibrancy that you've never seen before. That's, if you like, my product design. And oil paints are literally that simple. I mean, I'm probably making it sound over easy, but I'd love everyone to actually try the hand grinding so that you actually do see what we have to go through for you. It's a messy process. Not all the pigments are easy. Now, the other question that I often get asked is, where do you get the pigments from? We literally gather pigments from all over the world. In many cases, our pigments are coming from the same manufacturing giants, industrial giants that all the other paint makers are using. The Bayers, the Clariants, they're all out there and you can find them easily by Googling. We use all those same industrial suppliers, which make, of course, the abundance of the big product pigments that we're familiar with, the phthalos, the phthalocyanines, the quinacridones, the perylines, and so it goes on the long list of modern organic pigments. Pigments are broadly divided into two categories, organic and inorganic. Inorganics are things which don't really occur in nature as say, something which has grown or has ever lived. And so inorganics tend to be things which are either dug out of the ground in the form of, say, for an example, a natural earth, which usually are iron oxides as a base, or you can have other sort of inorganic pigments like the cadmiums, for instance, are also because cadmium sulfide, selenium. These are all elements that, although they've generally been dug out of the ground or refined at some point industrially, they don't occur in nature in the form of things like hydrocarbons, which are effectively how we make organic pigments, or they make organic pigments. So, not to be confused, don't think for a minute just because a pigment is described as being organic, it's somehow green in its credentials and is more natural and better for you. That's the food industry. That's something completely different. From your point of view, it doesn't make a huge difference, except generally you will notice that an organic pigment, and I'm thinking of the likes of quinacridones, alizarin crimsons, arylamides, diarylamides, all Hansas, all those, usually will be very high in oil absorption and transparent and very fluffy, very dusty, and they have a very high oil content, therefore, which probably gives me the opportunity to also talk about the fat over lean principle, which I think confuses a lot of artists. You'll hear this expression, fat over lean. Now, the simple way to test if something's fat or whether it's lean is to take a tube of each in your hand. Put it this way, if you take, say, a cadmium yellow or a titanium white or, I don't know, an earth color, you'll notice that's heavier than something like alizarin crimson or Prussian blue. So if a color is heavy, that's lean. That's the meaty one. If the color is light, that's the fat. It's got a lot of fat and oil in it. They're both made to the same criteria in our case of maximum pigmentation. The difference being, of course, is that if you've got a very thirsty pigment, we use the example of Prussian blue, it takes up a lot of oil. And it uses, I mean, you might find with a Prussian blue that the ratio of pigment to oil might be as little as 20 to 25% Prussian blue pigment and 75% oil. And conversely, take a cadmium yellow, it'll be the other way around. Now, that is to do with the particle shape and size. Now, as I said before, when oil dries, cures, polymerizes, it actually technically isn't drying because when you think of something drying, like in the case of, say, a watercolor, it's the absence of the water that evaporates off, leaving a residue. Oil paints are different. They actually dry, cure, polymerize by absorbing oxygen from the atmosphere. And when it does that, it gets slightly bigger and heavier because you get more of it. You're talking possibly 10% in some cases. So the oilier a paint, the greater expansion that's going to have when it dries. So that matters when you're doing your painting and you're structuring your painting. And it only really matters when you really break the rule dramatically. That's my observation and experience anyway. So what you don't want to do, of course, is do the initial layers of your painting with very oily fat layers and then as a foundation, and then go over the top with very lean layers. Now, I always give the example of supposing I decide I'm going to paint a nocturne. So I think, yeah, Prussian blue, nice and high in oil absorption. I'm going to do a nice sky. So I trowel it on. I'm going to be really generous with the paint today. 16th of an inch, nice, like icing a cake, but frosting a cake. I really layer it on, and I let that dry. And of course, when you let something like Prussian blue dry, it's a very fast dryer, and it will produce a very, very oily, dry, layered surface quite quickly. After something like a month, it will be, more than touch dry, but it'll have its own paint film, which will be consistently dry. Now, supposing I then look at my nocturne and I think, you know what, I'm going to put some white fluffy clouds. I've decided my nocturne's going to be in moonlight now. So I'm going to daub on big fluffy white clouds, again troweling it on, titanium white or lead white, whichever is my chosen white, nice and thick. That particular Prussian blue underneath, lean whites over the top, could be very problematic because I've fundamentally broken the rules of fat over lean there. I've actually buried under the very lean the fat, whereas it should be the other way around. Now, if you paint it so that you paint wet into wet, in other words, I did my Prussian blue sky, and then before that paint was dry, I immediately daubed in my white clouds. That would have been better because you see, if you have a layer of Prussian blue which is dried, it's not going to interface so much with the next layer of paint. And then I put my clouds over the top like that. It means that there are two distinct layers. And of course, as that paint of the Prussian blue expands, and of course, the leaner the color, less oil, the less expansion that's going to take place. As the underlayer flexes like this layer on top will hardly move. And not surprisingly, they become even more two distinctly different paint layers. And well, you can guess 30, 40, 50 years, not surprisingly, you've got a very high chance that the clouds are going to just basically flake off. I sort of invented that in my head as the worst case scenario of how something can go wrong in a painting. So try and think of ways to do it the other way around. At a prima, all one go is by far the best in terms of incorporating that all round. Now, alternately, if you are the type of artist who builds up in layers and perhaps glazes, and I'll explain in a second what a glaze is as well. You just have to be mindful that as you add your layers, use your leaner colors underneath and don't sort of flip back to using something very oily, let it dry and then come back over the top. Again, you have to be careful where you might have thought a painting's finished and done some very oily layers and even oiled out. And then, of course, go over the top. That is when you're tempting fate, as we say. So try and just be mindful of keeping paint so that the layers are at least moist between each other so you get that interphase. I mentioned the term glaze, and for any of you who don't know what a glaze is, supposing you're painting my portrait and you do all the brush work and then, yeah, that's all right. That's, I've done well here. And then you look at it and think, I wish I'd made the shadow. Don't want, trying to get a shadow on my face here. I wish I'd made it so that the shadow was more dramatic here. I don't want to have to paint that whole section because I liked all the brush strokes. If you like, a glaze is a bit of a cheat because you can make a shadow over the top. It's like a thin veil of color going over. And the way we do that is with a glaze medium. And as I'm sure you're aware, we make a number of glaze mediums. Now, in the example of doing this, the shadow, I perhaps might take a burnt umber and mix it into the glaze medium so it looks the consistency, shall we say, of something like a black tea or even a coffee without any milk in it. Now, of course, as I paint that thinly over that section of face, which of course has to be dry, what it does then, of course, it produces a transparent layer of the brown and creates the effect of shadow. So if you like, it's a trick. All the colors will get slightly influenced by that brown, and if you like, muted by it. But it also means that, of course, the lights on the other side of the face will start to pop and come up the other way. So that's a traditional technique of creating a glaze. A lot of people always want me to talk about toxicity. Now, bear in mind that something can only poison you if it gets inside you. So, of course, the trick is not to let it get inside you. Things like this is a complete no-no. I mean, that's got a great point in it anyway, but by the by, I've just been sitting here fiddling with it for the last sort of half hour. There's only so many ways something can get inside you through the mouth, through the eyes, inhalation, paint on hands going onto food. And before the call started, we were talking about how we've all done this thing where you'll have a cup of water or a cup of drink in your studio, and then you go to it with the brush and you're going for your solvent or your water, or whatever it is, to cleanse your brush. And of course, you're inadvertently in one of these, and you don't know it because you're in the heat of the moment, the painting. The next thing you take a swig of your drink, and lo and behold, you suddenly taste that you've got paint or solvent or whatever it might be, and you spit it out. That's the sort of silly thing where you can. That gives you an example of how the misadventure can sort of occur. If you should sand a painting, which in my mind, sanding a painting is highly unusual and unnecessary. And I always caution artists on this, let alone from inhalation. If you're sanding a painting to repurpose it to paint over again, you're almost certainly going to be breaking that fat over lean principle. So sanding a painting is a bit redundant anyway, in my mind. treat yourself to a new bit of linen, board, whatever you're painting on, and make a fresh start is much healthier and less labor intensive. But anyway, should you have a process which involves sanding, anything, even sawdust, is seen as a danger. So mask or outside or whatever you want to do. Um, Other areas, should you smoke in your studio? And I remember pointing out to an artist once who used to get paint all over their hands, and she said to me that she always washed her hands before eating. And I said, "But you're smoking." And she said, "Well, what's wrong with that?" And I said, "Well, look at the side of your cigarette. You could see there was paint on the side of the cigarette." And I said, "Look, I'm not saying it's happening here, but if that cadmium paint is burnt and inhaled, you're liberating it in its most poisonous form, and I believe is cadmium oxide. So that's another thing you want to keep away from. Other aspects, let me think of where there was another artist I knew years ago, and one of the few artists who I generally know got poisoned by materials. And she called me up and she was saying that she had heavy metal poisoning. Oh my God, how did that happen? And she said, "Oh no, it wasn't from your paints or anything." She said, "When I tell you my process, I love to walk on the beach and I pick up driftwood, and I love it when you get that old paint from whatever use it's had before." She said, I take that driftwood back to my studio and I scorch it all with a blowtorch to enhance it and make it blister. Oh no, don't tell me it wasn't a ventilated studio. And she said, "Yeah." And I wasn't wearing a mask, and I've been doing it for years. And so that explains to you folks, you've got to think and consider your painting environment. Now, we do quite a number of mediums. We do both mediums based on turpentine, genuine old-fashioned turpentine, which I personally love because I love the smell. However, there is a health concern with that, and you should really only paint in a well-ventilated studio if you're using turpentine-based products. We also do a range of products, which I'd love to talk about now and introduce to you, which is our range of miracle medium-based mediums. Now, you might think that the term miracle medium sounds too good to be true. However, I'll tell you how it was born. As you can imagine, I sit and talk to hundreds of artists, quite literally, and I ask them, what would you like from me? And it isn't just sometimes, a new wacky pigment or a color that's not in the range. Often it'll be, and the conversation went on this particular day, and I was talking away and I said, well, we'd love to be able to have a medium that we can have in the studio which doesn't smell. Yes, there are already plenty of odorless products, but if you start to read the small print, you realize that either the odor's been removed, and you'll see in the small print that there's still health concerns there. And just about, please read all the labels for everything. My stuff and everything you use. When you read the small print on a lot of those mediums, you'll realize that even if it's odorless, just because you can't smell it doesn't mean it's not there. Always ventilate your studio. However, so I was saying to these two artists, what would you like from me? And so they gave me a list, and the list went something like this. Odorless, non-toxic, non-flammable, can be used as a medium, can be used to clean up, doesn't give you a headache, it's great on the painting, no allergies, as if it couldn't be harder. And then I was sitting talking to a chemist friend, and I said this to him, and he's saying, "Well, there's quite a few things that we could probably play around in and create such a medium." I said, "You serious?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, "Oh, and vegan and 100% vegetable matter." And they went, "Yeah, okay, fine. Leave it with us." Anyway, a few months later, they came back to me with a number of samples of things. And of course, first of all, I gave it the sniff test, and I thought, yeah, yeah, okay, so what is it? Well, you wanted it 100% vegetable matter. It is. Ah, but is it solvent free? Totally. What about flammability? I screwed up a piece of newspaper. I set, this was outside. I screwed up a newspaper, set light to it, got it going, poured this liquid on. Hey presto, it went out. This is interesting. I put a blowtorch on it and a little metal discarded screw top cap, like a sort of thimble thing. And it just evaporated away. I could not get it to burn. So then I tried it in paint. What would it do in the paint? It, of course, increased the flow because it's described technically as a diluent. So it dilutes, it behaves like a solvent, but isn't a solvent. So it increases the flow of the paint. And then I made an observation, which was a really interesting, useful one. It was able to dissolve damar crystals. Okay. So if I've got something which can replace effectively turpentine, we're getting away from all those odors of the turpentine. And so I brushed it out and of course increased the flow. The only negative I could find was that if I added so much of it, then it would slow the drying speed down. And after about, if you increase by 15, 20%, I found that the drying speed would be slowed a lot. Some artists, as it turned out, liked that because it meant that the paint would remain more open for them to use. Color light fastness tests. I chose the synthetic Naples yellow as my because it's quite lean and I wanted to. It's a nice fruity, warm color. I'd had it around at the time, so I painted panels out with greater and less amounts of miracle medium added to it. And lo and behold, the only thing that I would ever notice was that if you increase the amount dramatically, it would slow the paint drying. The sheen of the paint, once dry, was exactly as the paint that was neat. We put it in a light fastness. We have a box. I call it a box. It's a Sun Lab thing. So we put all our test samples of pigments and paints in this light box and accelerated its exposure to UV light by, so a month in there is like the equivalent of just about a year. And even after 2, 3 years, we were noticing no change other than you'd expect with the pigment anyway. I mean, we can talk about that in a minute as well, how certain pigments will change. So that's why we were able to create quite a number of our miracle mediums out of this one material. We've still kept the existing range of traditional Damar and Austrian Larch Turpentine, Canada Balsam mediums, which you'll find on our website. And the miracle mediums are all listed there as well. We've got currently 4 miracle mediums. I love painting with it because it's also really useful to clean up with. And my wife, who gets a little bit of asthma, doesn't complain at me anymore about smells. And I'd love everyone to try it. We're going to be doing a lot of samples of this stuff soon. So I'm sure we'll get some up to Gwartzman so they can hand it out and let people try it as well like that. And we've already had huge success with that in the UK. So it's slowly getting known in North America. Now, another product which I'd love to tell you about is also our non-absorbent acrylic primers, our range of naps. Again, when I sit and talk to artists and I receive phone calls from artists, and I field, if you like, their problems. The one reoccurring one I've had most of the time from artists is they call me up and the conversation goes something like this. Oh, Michael, I did a painting yesterday in the studio. It looked great. I loved your colours and everything like that. I've walked into the studio this morning. All the colours have gone dull on matte. In other words, they've sunk. That's the term that we artists use for it. So all the colours have sunk. Why? What's going on? And I said, you're painting on an acrylic gesso, aren't you? And they go, yeah, how do you know? And then I explained, well, you've got to remember that an acrylic gesso is very porous, so it will suck all the oil out of the paint and make it look very dull. I know in the old days, I used to sort of recommend a number of tricks to avoid that in terms of, if you like, quenching the thirst with oil before you start and things like that, or build up thick layers. And invariably, artists find themselves doing things like oiling out or using a retouch varnish to cure this, which can be problematic because, of course, bear in mind our conversation a few minutes ago about the fat over lean principle. If you've got early stages of your painting that have gone dull and matte, and now you're oiling out, in other words, putting a very thin layer of linseed oil over, you've immediately, if you then paint over the top with more paint, you've immediately broken that fat over lean principle. So I try and find a way for artists to avoid that. I researched and I was able to find an acrylic resin that when I combined it with certain other pigments, it doesn't do this. It behaves just like other acrylic gessos. I prefer to call it a primer because I think the term gessos in this context is slightly misleading. Traditional gesso was of course made with rabbit skin glue and chalk. Acrylic gesso is acrylic resin and calcium carbonate chalk or titanium. And of course, it's as porous as can be, and it makes paint look terrible in my mind. You see, personally, as an artist, when I'm painting, when I put a brushstroke down and I like it, leave it, that's the brushstroke I want to be there in 30 years' time. I don't want to see changes. And it doesn't matter whether it's the fruitiness or the moist lookingness of it, or should it be a matte area, that's the brushstroke I want. I don't want changes, particularly painting while I'm painting over the sort of the days or months as I paint. So this acrylic primer that we were able to create does not draw out the oil in the same way. It still has enough interphase, and when I talk about interphase, microscopically, there's enough for the paint to adhere to in terms of contour. In fact, we put 5% of the primer, you wouldn't believe it, feeling it, is mica. So if you do this with your fingertips, You can't see this. I mean, it's absolutely invisible. There's minute little ground. It feels as if you're touching ground glass, and that introduces tooth. So it helps it adhere. We've had huge success with this to such an extent. We of course launched white, I think about 6, 7 years ago. And then immediately people started saying this is great because my colors don't sink anymore. So we had requests for other colors. And you'll find on our website that we're doing about a dozen colors. We're in the process of introducing 3 more colors. People invariably ask me, well, will you do acrylic paints one day, Michael? No, I won't. I only do something if I really, as a painter, like it myself. And acrylic paints, and I'm not going to be unkind about them, can never, from my point of view, compare to the lusciousness you get with oil paint. And it's as simple as that. Yes, I appreciate some of you might want to have paint layers dry within 30 minutes. I can't work like that. Not only that lack of the luminosity. So no, I would never be doing acrylic paints. Um, we got lots of requests for different colors, and you'll see on our website we do everything from a black, a transparent, various sienna colors for sort of a transparent one, so you can do it over a white and get it sort of like a griselle color. We do siennas, we do a moss green, which I particularly like for portraiture. I found that if you're painting someone's face, say like mine, Caucasian, I've got sort of a lot of red in my face. I'm very, my cheeks are florid, all the rest of it. If I paint on a green ground, I love getting that sort of complementary thing going where you let the greens come through in the shadows, sort of under the chin, under the nose, and you get the complementary of the red green thing going on. So the moss green, I absolutely adore myself for portraiture, and you'll see that we do lots of colours. And we've now recently added a mid-shade blue, a mid-shade yellow, and a mid-shade red. And you'll find all the color index numbers on the containers. They're all light fast in their own right, so that if that does show through in your painting, that will still retain the light fastness of that color. I mean, so if you've got a painting which is fairly open, it will show that through. About 3 years ago, well, long story short, I've been asked so many times over the decades if I would ever do watercolors. And I'm also a watercolor artist. I started developing watercolors about 20 years ago. And because of the success of the oils, I was never given a chance to actually fulfill this plan. Then, of course, eventually COVID came along. And not only was I able to do a lot of my own painting, it meant that we could also finish off the formulations of the watercolors. And so we launched a range of watercolors. I think we're just about in our 3rd year now. When I developed the watercolors, I didn't want to just bring out a watercolor which was like everyone else's. There'd be absolutely no point. So I wanted to make paint that was shockingly intense, vivid in every respect. I wanted it to parallel also the oil range in the sense that if I have a nice, interesting pigment within the oil, where I wanted to also bring it across and use it in the watercolor. Now, of course, because we have a lot of lead whites, lead yellows, vermilion, and other exotic heavy metals in the oils, because watercolors are what I call a semi-open system, in other words, because they behave, it's not as if they're encapsulated within oil. Certain pigments and the lead whites and vermilion can, on occasion, have a negative effect with the atmosphere. So I didn't want to take a chance on having what I called an open system. And also, I thought, well, why make a watercolor paint that's toxic? So we decided we'd leave out all the toxic colors. You'll notice cadmiums and cobalts, which I don't regard as toxic, and you can see all the health and safety, the Prop 65s are there, and you can make your own educated guesses on whether you want to use it or not on that basis. But we have to adhere to North American rules about that sort of stuff. So there are no lead whites, there's no vermilion, there's no lead yellows in the watercolors, which of course meant that I had some gaps in the range. Now, also, I've accumulated so many samples that pigment companies sent to me, which I'd been playing around with for years. And of course, as soon as I made it into watercolor, I'd be looking at things and going, oh, this is great. Look at this. It's beautiful. I mean, one which always comes to mind is Perylene Violet, Pigment Violet 29 for the people who like the color index system. When I made it into watercolor, I just thought, oh, it's gorgeous, it's gorgeous. Particularly if you use it in clouds. I do a lot of sunsets. I know it sounds cliche, but what the hell? Maybe I'm a cliche painter. If you've got a sunsetty sky and you're using Indian yellow, and you go and put perylene violet, you're in for a treat. It's just something about the relationship of those two colors I personally love. When I saw it in watercolor, I thought, no one does this in an oil. Is there some type of compatibility problem? There isn't. No one has either chosen or thought to do it. So we also brought it out as one of our new 40 colors in our oils, and I'll explain why there was 40 new colors in a second. So I got my hands on so many new pigments when I was making the watercolors, and we launched with a range of something like 134, 135 in the range of watercolors. And, the success is growing all the time. Huge success in the UK already, and it's slowly getting more and more known in the United States and Canada. When we were developing them and thinking about how to do it, someone reminded me, Michael, do you realize you've been making paint for 40 years now? Hey, this is like 40 new, it's a celebration. So we decided, it's basically like a festival for us. 40 new colors to celebrate 40 new years. And we put them into sets, and each of those sets reflects a stage, if you like, of my artist and my paint making life. The first one is the Tunbridge Wells set, which that's where, of course, I had the bedroom in the friend's house. And then I moved to Brick Lane with Atlantis. And then I moved to Whitechapel. I mean, these are all nice historic parts of London. Whitechapel, of course, is famous for that's where Jack the Ripper did his horrible deeds back in the 19th century, in a yard which had been originally occupied by a house which Captain Cook and his family lived in at 88 Mile Inn Road. There's still a plaque to this day commemorating the house there. And I occupied it has a brick chimney to this day, beautiful old mews-like buildings. And that's why I had color making done for about I did color making for about 10 years before I moved to Wales, to the Brecon Beacons, southwest part of England. And the irony, coming back to the Captain Cook story, is that I read a biography of Captain Cook a few years ago, and it mentioned that he and his family weren't happy living at 88 Mile End Road because of the smell of the gin distillery out the back. And when I read that, oh, my eyes lit up, because that's my building, and so it sort of is rather nice to think it had come full circle. Jackie, have we got some questions for people?
I was just wondering, would you suggest a sealer for the painting after it cures? And
Yes, you mean a varnish, I believe.
yeah, yeah. Or
Okay,
even
yeah,
like a what do you call it? One that doesn't make it kind of like shiny, but just
absolutely. Sounds if you're
matte.
describing a matte varnish or a satin varnish.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
the first thing I always urge artists to do before committing, don't go and just buy one and think, okay, load it on. It could, from your point of view, ruin your work. And it's worthwhile. I mean, it sounds as if this work has taken a significant amount of your time and effort, and you want to get this right. So the first thing you should do is practice and understand the nature of each varnish. Find a discarded paint surface. It could be a dried up old palette. It could be a painting you did 5 years ago now, totally discarded, and just paint out little squares of the various varnishes, or some varnishes come in a spray form as well. But test first. This is so important because it can change the effect of your painting, and that could be bad. Now, the books recommend, and this is a very interesting debate, the books recommend at least 6 months to leave the paint to cure, polymerize, to make absolutely sure it's completely dry before applying the varnish. And the old school of thought was that you want the varnish to be, you remember when I said I was talking about separate layers remaining as separate layers, you want the varnish to be almost a separable layer. What we have to remember is that a varnish is only a temporary coat on a painting. It's designed to be removed 100 years, 200 years. And bear in mind, when your blue bird is hanging in a very eminent gallery somewhere, 100, 200 years' time, it's going to get dirty. And of course, the varnish is the temporary coat, if you know what I mean, so that catches the dirt, and then the restorer will remove the varnish and the dirt will come with it, and they then will apply another varnish. Now, there is a debate, quite an interesting one, about whether or not it's necessary to wait 6 months to varnish a painting. I know that there's one or two proprietary brands of varnish that have been brought out. I know Gamblin have one which they recommend can be painted on a paint as soon as it's touch dry. I see no problem with that. I have a friend, Chuck Morden, who's produced a paper which discusses, and it's a long semi-scientific read. We have it published on our website. So for any of you out there who are interested by this discussion of whether a painting should wait 6 months, an oil painting that is, until it's varnished, it's a big debate. And I honestly don't know. I can tell you what the books say. You could think, well, okay, I'm just be on the safe side and wait 6 months anyway. Fine. I mean, Chuck's paper goes into huge descriptions of the stages that the paint goes through. Chuck is also a scientist, chemist, and he does a lot of he has a lot of access to analytical materials. So he presents an argument that it doesn't make any difference, and I'm totally open to the discussion. But no, you should eventually varnish your painting for sure, to simply act as a coat to protect it from dirt. We make a handful of varnishes. It's something that I'm working on still in terms of developing more. Our varnishes at the moment are quite basic in terms of we do a matte varnish, which is based on turpentine and beeswax. And we also do a damar one, which is damar crystals dissolved in turpentine. Those will smell. The latter, of course, is glossy. You can experiment on mixing the two together, and you need something like a 1:6 ratio. The beeswax in the matte varnish has quite a prolific effect. So you'll find that 1 part of matte varnish to about 5 parts of damar will get you a sort of a satin finish. Always experiment with this before you commit to the painting, folks. Do we have any others?
Yes, there was a question. Andrea asked if I have a bit of Gamvar left and can I add it to the miracle medium?
I wouldn't. And also begs me the question, why would you want to? Gamvar being Gamblin's varnish. No, either varnish it or use the miracle medium as a medium. Don't use the miracle medium as a varnish is another answer to that question. I mean, it might be that she has got not enough to do the painting, so she thinks you can add this to that, and therefore she'll have enough material. I urge artists to always, 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 always give your paintings the best shot you can. If it's something that's playing a major part of your life, honor them. Don't cut corners. Don't skimp. Particularly if you're a professional, you can't afford to. Make the best painting. Use the best materials you can get. If you want to use Gamvar, use Gamvar. Get enough. Do the job properly.
Yeah, they actually meant to say Gamsol. I'm going to assume that is the same.
Okay,
thing.
Gamsol. You could mix the two together because, of course, Gamsol is Gamblin's solvent. The only thing, of course, is that the credentials that I created the miracle medium for was to avoid, Gamsol is a solvent, and you can tell it by the name. I believe I'm right in saying that it has warnings on its label about painting in a well ventilated area. So in a sense, if you're just looking to mix the liquids to see what will happen, yes, technically you could. But if you are painting to try and avoid, if you're using miracle medium to try and avoid smells and allergies, bear in mind the Gamsol, read the small print on the Gamsol and see what it can and can't do. And if that still doesn't matter to you, mix and see what happens, see what effect you get.
So we do have another question, Michael.
Sure.
Someone, Diane, has written she just tried the miracle medium for the first time for oil block in and wondering if still okay to also add some walnut oil for making the paint a bit more fluid. Some colors don't need any oil to flow well.
That's absolutely right. I mean, yes, if walnut is your chosen oil as a medium to add, absolutely. There's no reason at all. These are all intermixable materials. However, there's a golden rule with golden, not to be confused with golden acrylics, by the way. There's a golden rule for me, only use a medium if you can't achieve in what's in your mind's eye. There's no rule that you have to be using a medium, in other words. If you can achieve with paint straight out of the tube, the effect, the surface, the brush stroke that you're looking for, then you don't need a medium.
I saw you put your hand up. Did you have a question?
But it was just about the what kind of mask you actually use, because I have a brain injury and I'm very sensitive now since then to chemical scents.
Right.
So I've tried ones that will actually keep scent out, but it's not. Is there a specific kind that you use and recommend?
I'm not a medic. It's one of those things that you're probably better off conducting your own research on. I know that is it an NP 95? It was
95.
yeah, which is seen as a sort of a general pretty good one. But then again, if you read the documentation that comes in those things, that they're only good for so many hours or minutes, or they will effectively clog up, and it's so easy to get lazy with that, and you find yourself working with the same one for weeks. If you are sensitive, I personally would love you to try my miracle medium, because I know that its credentials are such that even if you drink it, it's not going to poison you. It tastes disgusting. So even if you did add it inadvertently, you're not going to do it twice. It tastes disgusting, I have to say. Not to be confused with wine. Always well ventilate your studio. I mean, I know Canada's not the warmest part of the world for a big chunk of the year, but I think in your context, it probably would pay to make sure everyone should well ventilate a studio. If you're using just oil paint, my oil paint that is, I have to stress, and I'll come back to that in just a second. I'm confident that you will have no problem, because linseed oil itself, of course, is used as a health supplement. We don't put any other solvents in the paint whatsoever. So you shouldn't get any interactions like that. If you've used stuff already that's giving you headaches, reactions, and sensitivity, read that small print that's on those materials, and I think you'll find stuff that you don't want to see, because it's clearly you've got an increased sensitivity. I remember some years ago I was doing a workshop over in Calgary, and we were in a huge room, and there was a lady came in. She sat right at the back, and everyone else was down, probably 20, 30 people. They're all down near me. And she was way off. And I said to her, why don't you come and sit down here? And she said, I can't. I wanted to come along. I can't paint with oils anymore. But I wanted to hear you talk about materials and stuff like that. I said, why can't you paint with oils? I'm sensitized. And I said, well, what happens to I get chronic headaches? I went, okay. I said, I promise there's nothing we'll do here today which will give you a headache. And immediately, of course, I had to make sure that I didn't open any of my turpentine-based mediums. However, the oil paints, I said, look, I promise you, and I invite you to take, and I gave her 2 or 3 tubes. I said, go and open them in your home, spread a bit out, sit with them in the room. I am so confident that you won't get a headache. So she did. She called me the next day in tears, and she said, Mr. Harding, you're so right. I realize now I can't paint with the other brands, but I can paint with yours. And it's because there's quite a lot of exotic things that some paint makers put in the paint. No, I'm not saying other paint makers' paint is somehow all wrong because of the way they've done it. I just make my paint another way, and I don't put those things in. There's things like oxygen scavengers and dryers, which will, they're more volatile substances, and that's what people were reacting to, and that's where the headaches come from.
I've been using Gablin, and even when they say like it's solvent free, I'm still sensitive, so I'm gonna definitely try your miracle medium and see.
Please do, and let me know how you get on with it. I can sit here with confidence and actually say that we've sold thousands upon thousands of bottles of it. I've not had any single person contact me and say, sorry, I don't care what you say, Michael, I'm still getting headaches. No one to this date. So I would love you to try some. But ventilating a studio anyway is always a good idea. I mean, that's if you find that there's something in that gambling range that you have to have, then just work around, ventilate. I don't think a mask would ever be a cure, because of course a lot of these things are they're almost gaseous.
Yep.
So they're going to pass through whatever physical mesh or structure you've got there. I mean, it's airborne. And of course, we have to inhale to breathe. So, yeah, if it was particles, like if you were sanding something, it's more physical. But when something's more of a gas, no, it's going to be a problem.
And just thank you for creating your watercolor range.
Oh,
I got them at Gwartzman's when they had a sale to try them out, and I've like switched over from like Stone Ground to Harding, and I just really love them.
bless you for saying that. Thank you so much. I'm glad they do the trick for you. Is there any particular colors that you find particularly interesting?
Well, for the hues like that I can make from like the hooker's green, and like
Oh,
I do a
yeah.
lot of landscapes, so
Yeah.
I really like those in particular. And the rose madder,
Oh,
and the opera rose, which I have to get more because they're
oh,
out of stock right now. But
if you ever have a moment and access to a black light, a UV light, and this is just for fun, put it on a painting which has got opera rose in it. You'll be amazed by what you see. It literally fluoresces in the dark. It's extraordinary. And it's amazing where that opera rose can creep to. And you put the light on, it's just a fun thing. I mean, it's purely for fun. No, the rose madder, of course, is real. It's a Rubia tinctorium. It actually comes from a plant root.
Oh, there is one more question. I actually have a question for you.
Yep,
You
sure.
just mentioned about opera rose and putting it under a black light. I know
Yep.
with many artists, fluorescent colors have become extremely popular, even in oil paints. Which
Yep.
of your colors would you suggest would be a great replacement for using a fluorescent colors?
Another little bit of news is the company that made us the pigment for the opera rose, which is sort of an exotic form of quinacridone, which is fluorescent, also makes quite a few of those other shades, vivid yellows, greens, oranges, and another sort of pinky shade. We're exploring those as to whether we'd put them in I won't say in the range permanently, but we might bring them out as one-off specials just for fun to see if people like them. Nothing, in all honesty, will have the same resonance visually as those colors. I mean, yeah, you could take certain intense colors like, say, yellow benzimidazolone and put it with a white. But you see, those fluorescent colors, what they're actually doing, they're taking light from the invisible part of the spectrum that we can't see and converting it into the visual that we can. So that's why they apparently seem to glow as if there's a light there. I mean, as you can imagine, we only see, and I don't want to bore everyone with physics here, but of all the light and radiation, don't get the wrong idea by radiant light that is around us, we're only seeing a little section of it. So if you can convert some other of that light that's invisible to us to light we can see, that's why it has the apparent appearance of being fluorescent. That's how it works. Now, usually, of course, those pigments aren't as light fast as we'd ideally like. And that's the only thing that's holding me back. The opera rose, we've got to a point where we can certainly make it every bit as light fast as, say, alizarin crimson, which is borderline of where we'd all like to be. However, I have a lot of discussions in North America with some artists, of course, come down very firmly like, no, you should never use alizarin crimson, and that's the pigment red 83. You should only use the permanent version, or we do both. We call it alizarin claret because if you use the term permanent alizarin, it sort of implies the other one's not. And the other one, the genuine one, the alizarin crimson, back in the 19th century, that was the go-to clarity color. And there's plenty of examples of that still surviving wonderfully. Do your own experiments, put paint on a window ledge and also some in the shade, and tear a piece of paper in half. So one piece of paper goes and lives in a room in shade, and then the other one in light, and see how much it changes, and see if you can. I mean, we don't put our Rembrandts out into Florida sunshine, do we? And you've never visited a national collection and seen Titian's and Velasquez over in bright light over by the window. So, all pigments will eventually fail. It's just a question of when. The longer, the better, of course. And these fluorescent colors are fun. And I know one or two artists because you see, although I'm very much a traditional painter myself and hence the huge interest in the old masters and the old masters pigments. I still, of course, supply an enormous amount of paint to highly contemporary artists. The names are out there, we know them. They paint in some really weird and wonderful and wacky ways. And I can't tell them not to paint in certain ways. So, of course, I'm constantly trying to find pigments that are going to stimulate and interest them as well. And certainly these fluorescent, yeah, they've got a lot of artists' attention. Now, the other thing, of course, you can do is take a little bit of it and combine it with others. So you could take a fluorescent yellow and combine it, say, with a cadmium yellow, just a little bit. It'd still have the appearance of being glowing fluorescent. And should it fail in 30, 40, 50, 100 years' time, you've still got the cadmium yellow in the background to catch it, if you know what I mean. So you can consider that as well. I wish all artists would test, both everything from the varnish and what it will do to your paint to paint swabs in a window. The more understanding all artists can have of their materials, the better artist you will be, for sure.
Thank you, Michael. I have one question. Sylvie has written in. While I love the miracle medium, do you have any preferences or comments on linseed oil, walnut oil, and safflower oil?
Get to know them. They all do slightly different things. They all have slightly different virtues. Linseed oil, of course, is the most common. It's the most robust. What I mean by that is it's got physically the greatest strength. Safflower oil is the palest, well, slower to dry, and rather annoyingly, I mean, I've been doing a painting recently, and I use safflower oil playing around in a medium, and even though it's touch dry, it's rendered it slightly sticky. So for me, that's a sort of I've known that for years, and I combined it with another material, another oil, but obviously, it's stickier than I would like after a month. So again, that's me learning the material still. And walnut oil also. They all have different properties. Get to know them. Look at the colors, and where you see them in a jar, bottle, whatever it is, of course, that is the apparent color. Now, the worst thing that can happen, of course, is that oil comes to the surface of the paint. I mean, you think about a white, and you'll get a glazed color effect of the natural oil, particularly if the painting's been allowed to dry in the dark. Allowing your paintings to dry in a very good light is far better. It keeps those oils much cleaner and less tending. I mean, you can do an experiment with this. You do a white panel with linseed oil based paint, put it in the dark, let it dry in the dark for a month, bring it out, and you'll see it's a gloomy yellow color. After about 48 hours, it'll get lighter, particularly if you've put it into good light, but it'll never get as light as if you'd painted and kept the whole painting in good light. So always dry your paintings in a good light.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? I know I've gotten a couple comments on asking if they can come and visit your factory.
I get asked this a lot, and it's a tricky thing for me because every time we have a visitor, I have to get their name, send it off to my insurance company, insure them. And that's why we don't tend to do a lot of visits. However, I'm there probably 50% of the time, and I would love it if I could take everyone there, and then you really will see Michael Harding as the Willy Wonka in his chocolate factory. I run around like a kid when I'm in there. I just can't be controlled. Yeah, I would love it if people could come. Unfortunately, it's probably best that I have to say sorry, folks. I just can't do that. We do make videos from time to time and do a little show around that way, which would be better than nothing. Maybe I should do a Zoom call sometime and get my daughter and my wife to conduct it, and I can do my Willy Wonka routine for you all.
Well, I would certainly like to see the Willy Wonka routine. And if as for me, it's always a pleasure to be able to chat with you. I think the few times that we've been able to talk at a trade show, you are a wealth of information, and you make oil painting sound so easy.
It is.
so enjoyable.
I always say to artists, don't make it harder than it already is. I mean, if you understand the materials and make them your friends, so you can predict, and you don't even have to be predicting consciously. Once you know what they will and won't do, it becomes part of it goes in the brain and it just becomes part of your autopilot. And you just cruise with them, and there's a fluency which comes. So it is easy. But there's a path that you have to, a path of sort of reasonability of what the material can and can't do. And it's when we go off sideways on the path and start trying to make it do things that it can't, and that's when you're going to have a problem. But anyway, I've certainly enjoyed it, and please don't forget you can email me afterwards. Any questions if you had a shyness attack, doesn't matter. Just email Jackie at Gwartzman's or myself. My own personal email address is oilpaint@michaelharding.co.uk. I invite you all to peruse our website. You'll find our whole stack of information there, including the list of the new colours which will be coming out in Q1. All the stuff about the miracle medium, it's all there again. And please also have a look at Chuck Malden's paper on varnish, when to varnish, when not to varnish. But thank you, everyone. It's been fun.